So it is Reviews Day Tuesday. This week it is the Quietest Mouse book club and I will be reviewing Death Comes to Pemberley by P.D. James. This book is set 6 years after the end of Pride and Prejudice. It is the eve of a ball which is held every year at Pemberley. They are preparing for the ball when suddenly Lydia Wickham appears. She tumbles out of a carriage and says that her husband has been killed. Darcy, Colonel Fitzwilliam and a new character called Alveston go into the woods to discover what has happened. They find George Wickham leaning over the body of his friend Captain Denny. Denny is dead and Wickham is charged with his murder. But did he do it? And how did Denny die? I didn't get on particularly well with this book. I'm going to start off by saying some of the things I didn't like about it, and then I'll say some of the things I did like about it, and then you can make up your own mind. In my opinion, this didn't work particularly well as a sequel to Pride and Prejudice. I was expecting it to have something of the style of Jane Austen, but it doesn't really. There were moments when P.D. James sort of channeled Austen, and it was like, yes, I can see you as a continuation of the Pride and Prejudice story, but for the most part, I didn't see it as much of a sequel. There were a few little continuity errors, there were a few little occasions where I wasn't sure I was remembering the same Pride and Prejudice as this book was. Also, I'm not sure the characters were entirely believable as Austen's characters. Elizabeth, for instance, didn't show so much of her wit and independence as you would expect. Also, I found that without Austen's subtle touch, Lydia became a bit much. Lydia in Pride and Prejudice is pretty annoying, but she is recognisable. You see her through the sisterly eyes of Elizabeth, so she never becomes too ridiculous, and she's quite a comedic character. In Death Comes to Pemberley, I found Lydia to be a bit more of a caricature. I did, however, find Lady Catherine de Bourgh to be pretty well painted in this book, and Mr. Bennet, I thought, was, I think, one of my favourite characters. Just felt like he'd stepped out of Pride and Prejudice and entered this realm, but those were pretty much the only two characters where I wasn't a bit disappointed. There were also some allusions to other Austen characters, which I wasn't entirely comfortable about. For instance, it mentions that Wickham went and worked for the Elliots for a bit. It brings in the characters from Persuasion. Also, Harriet Smith from Emma has some importance in the story later on, but I'm not going to tell you how. I didn't really think that was needed. The final thing which I had an issue with in this book was that it included two of my pet peeves in any story. The first one is that when a decision has to be made really, really quickly, a character makes the decision, but then goes into a little bit too much detail about why they have arrived at the decision. This happens a few times near the start of the novel when everything is going to hell at Pemberley after Lydia's arrival. For instance, there's a part when Elizabeth asks Mrs. Reynolds if they can quickly put Lydia to bed somewhere because she is ill, and Mrs. Reynolds is like, "Yes, madam, and a fire has already been lit. This room and 2 others are always prepared for Lady Anne's ball in case we get another October night like the one in '97 when the snow was 4 inches deep and some guests who had made a long journey could not get home. Shall we take Mrs. Wickham there? Everybody stop what you're doing. Just leave Lydia there on the floor, she'll be fine. I want to hear more about this room." And the other one is more specific to anything set in the past, and this is when a character alludes to something which is a lot worse then to now, and they're like, ha 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 ha, maybe in the future this will be better, ha 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 ha. Like there's a bit where they say, "I take it that your clever scientific colleagues have not yet found a way of distinguishing one man's blood from another's," and then the response is, "I regret not, we do not set out to be gods." So on to the good. I found that when I separated this book from Pride and Prejudice, I enjoyed it more. If you don't take these characters to be specific characters but new characters instead, I find that it then becomes a murder mystery set in Georgian England, and that's not a bad thing for it to be. I would like to read more murder mysteries set in Georgian England, and if you have any examples, please give them to me below. I'm a bit of a sucker for a trial scene, so I really enjoyed the whole trial part of the book, which is the trial of Wickham, and this gave me a lot more information about the Georgian period than Austen's books do. You know, it goes into more detail about the war which is going on, about the relationship between servants and their employers. As a piece of Georgian historical fiction, I think it works rather well. I'll give it a 3 out of 5. I'm not sorry I read this book, but I don't think I'm going to read it again. I would, however, gladly read another P.D. James book. So, if you want a murder mystery Pride and Prejudice sequel, I recommend the TV adaptation of Death Comes to Pemberley. The characters are much more recognisably Austen's characters in that. Elizabeth, for instance, is a lot more of her normal spirited self. They add a lot more sort of pacing and intrigue and suspense, which is one of the things which is lacking in this book. So if you like the idea of this story, then I think it was actually better executed in the TV adaptation, which is not a thing which I normally say, but in this case I think it might be true. If you just want to read a Georgian murder mystery, then great, this could be for you. This is that. If you want to read it as a curiosity, you know, P.D. James does Jane Austen, then great, I think that's a pretty good reason to read this book, and it was one of the reasons why I read it. But if you want a story which takes the characters from Pride and Prejudice and runs off with them in different directions and gives you different ways of looking at the characters, then I'm not sure this is the right book. I would recommend Lost in Austen, the ITV drama. That takes the characters from Pride and Prejudice and the story from Pride and Prejudice and just is constantly surprising you with different ways of looking at it. If you have read this book, what did you think of it? It wasn't for me, but it may be for other people. That's the thing about opinions, I guess. People have different ones. The next book I shall be reviewing is Wuthering, and that will be on the 23rd of September. After that, the book I am going to read is Gone Girl by Gillian, Flynn, and that review will be on the 7th of October. I am planning on reading the books which have been recommended to me in the comments of my videos, but I haven't had time to go and find them yet in libraries or bookshops. So that will happen, it's just not happening before the 7th of October. I hope you have a good day, and see you tomorrow.